All across the United States, the minimum wage seems to be going up to $15 an hour in cities such as Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle. Some say it is about time. Others say, like my friend Matthew here, that the pay hikes are actually going to hurt workers and companies. I am joined now by the Ebru think tank, Yohuru Williams, Vice President of Academic Affairs at Fairfield University, Matt Tyrmand from OpenTheBooks.com, and Professor F. Michael Higginbotham, Ghosts of Jim Crow. And Matthew, since I think you're going to be the Antonin Scalia of the group here and have the dissent, I'm going to have you talk first. Sure. Come on. $15 an hour. You need to make that in Manhattan. You can't commute into the city. It costs $15 to cross the bridge. It costs $2.75 each way to ride the subway. You spend $5 on lunch after 8 hours. You made nothing if you're making $8.25 an hour.
I agree, and we could talk for hours on the root causes of these price jumps over the last generation in things like tolls and public sector services, and there's an out-of-control government misallocating resources. We could talk about the price of food and inflation in the economy, and there's also crazy cross-currents going on. But very, very simply, empirically proven throughout history, when you raise the price of something, the demand for it drops. And the best example of contextualizing this right now, as we're seeing it all over the world, is McDonald's is now automating. So use McDonald's as this example of you can't have a living wage on McDonald's, so if you force the minimum wage up, they're going to go to robots and actually destroy jobs and minimize.
I understand. We got your point, and I hit you with a tough question, so I got to hit you with a tough question too, Euro. Come on. These people are flipping burgers. They're uneducated. They're working jobs that they're not supposed to retire in. My daughter and I and my sons all worked at minimum wage jobs, and it maybe paid for the incidentals that we needed while in school, but that was it. People need real jobs, not jobs that can be replaced by an automated kiosk. Your thoughts, sir?
And we have to be very frank in that discussion. It's part of what Ted Cruz said this week in a conversation with Tavis Smiley, where essentially what Cruz said is that my father came here as a dishwasher from Cuba, and the fact that he made 50 cents an hour ultimately gave him access to a job, and he was able to put money away and go to pay for school and ultimately be in a position to move up. The problem now is that the cost of education is so high. The opportunities in traditional fields are going away. Education, for example, teaching. So the real opportunity moments are in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. The opportunities for inner city students, for example, to have access to the best programs that will prepare them for those jobs are limited. It's a much bigger and deeper conversation about where we are in terms of the state of the economy as a whole. And I agree with you, Tyrmand, one that will ultimately require us, to a certain extent, to be very, very realistic about what it means. I'd like to see the minimum wage go up, but we'd also have to take into account all those other factors and the fact that automation is simply going to put more people in this precarious position of living, quite frankly, below the poverty line.
So this is a Band-Aid, it's not a fix?
Absolutely.
Okay. Michael, you come from Baltimore, a troubled area. We saw it explode after the Freddie Gray crisis. We saw neighborhoods that only had a CVS, and now they don't even have that. Tell us your take on the minimum wage. Is it going to help? I mean, come on, you pay people $15 an hour, everything's just going to get more expensive. The dollar menu is going to become the $3 menu, or people will lose their jobs and be replaced by robots. I mean, that's the reality of it all. You can't stay in a training level job, which is what the minimum wage is, beyond a year or two. You have to advance.
Well, I'm very concerned about people losing their jobs, and if that happens, if the minimum wage goes up, which I would like to see the minimum wage go up. I think workers need a living wage these days, but I don't want to see people lose their jobs. And when you mention Baltimore and you look at the unemployment level in some of the neighborhoods where the riots occurred, the unemployment level is 25–30%. When you have that sort of unemployment, which is like the Depression in 1929, you have that sort of unemployment, you get hopelessness, and that hopelessness leads to other problems. So what I'd like to see is, as our guest talked about, education. We need to reduce the price of our education. We need to improve our public schools. We need to give people an opportunity to make a decent living. And if we do that, I believe that other ills of our society will be reduced.
Let's turn to Robert Chase joining us via our DC connection. I'm actually thinking as you guys talk, and it's a rarity, I don't think that much, but I don't think the problem is college education. I think the problem is primary education. I think the problem is the family. I think the problem is that kids aren't being prepared to go to the next step. And so these problems that we talk about are deep-seated, are deep-rooted, are hard to fix, and that the minimum wage is just a Band-Aid. Sure, give people $15 an hour, I'll pay more for my Happy Meal.
Right. Well, you know, the part of the problem here is not just how little workers get paid, but how much CEOs these days get paid, and the top of the corporate ladder. The disparity of income between the very rich and the very poor is growing at an insurmountable rate every single decade. What did this replicate in our history? The Gilded Age. And what did that then produce? A series of progressive reforms. But even then, as one of your guests mentioned, the question of the Great Depression arose. So I think one of the things we have to think about is wealth income inequality on a greater scale, including the very rich and the very poor. And do our CEOs and those at the top of the corporate ladder need to rake in the tremendous amount of profit that they do, while those at the very bottom struggle to even feed their family, their children,
Okay,
and
I'm going to
themselves?
hold you there, Robert.
I do agree education is, yeah.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to turn to Matt because I know he strongly agrees with you. No, I'm just kidding. He strongly disagrees. We hear this all the time, income inequality, that CEOs get paid too much. Do you earn what you're worth?
322 million Americans. There are 2,000 publicly traded CEOs of publicly traded companies, and about another 5,000 to 10,000 of private entities.
So you're talking about the elite of the elite.
And you know what? The majority of these CEOs do not make the multiples that the Walmart CEO makes versus the line worker.
But also, if you're running Walmart, you're basically running a country, right?
And you have a lot of responsibility. You have very little job security. Now, I would suggest that a lot of publicly traded CEOs make too much because the incentives are misaligned with the way stock market works today, and the U.S. government has been a major proponent of pushing the stock market up and exploding the levels in CEO pay, because this is a market perversion. The best example on a micro level is I just got back from Seattle, and now they're a half year into this minimum wage hike, and I've noticed two things. I noticed, one, a lot of small businesses, these are CEOs of restaurants, they're closing their doors because they can't afford. The margins on restaurants are so low that if you take their employment expense and you jack it up by 30, 40, 50%, they're not viable. Job destruction. Number two is that the cost of everything in Seattle is going up. So what you have is essentially like a European-style value-added tax. It's a consumption tax, and there is nothing as regressive as a consumption tax. So all the highfalutin rhetoric about equalizing society, again, the net effect does exactly the antithesis of the goal.
I mean, Matt does have a point. You go into an area that has powerful labor unions, and houses cost for a starter home $500,000. Cops are making $100,000 a year. Teachers are making $100,000 a year. It costs $30 an entree at a restaurant. So it's all relative. If you have a right to work state where there are no unions and people are just earning what they earn, you have a $100,000 house. You have teachers making $25,000 or $35,000 a year. So it is all relative, correct?
Not necessarily. In fact, I think teachers are unfairly scapegoated, as some other individuals are unfairly scapegoated in this conversation. And
I
it's
don't know,
relative.
living in Bergen County, where teachers make $125,000 or $150,000 a year, I'll scapegoat them all I want.
Well, but that's Bergen County, and I think that's a very small sample size. And I think what's unfortunate is that when we get into conversations about right to work versus unions helped build America, and they built this narrative of the idea that a person could literally pull themselves up by their bootstraps, ultimately because we guaranteed wages and then we put other programs in there to ensure that a person had somewhat of a safety net. Having said that, it doesn't take away from Matthew's point that there needs to be some kind of reform, and we need to move in the other direction of thinking about how to correct this in a way that's equitable to all. But equity, equality should be the watchword in this conversation, and it's going to require us to think about these things in a way that doesn't necessarily go for the easy answer, which is that, well, income inequality and this group and that group are to blame. But ultimately, if America is going to be able to survive, we've got to think about this in the context of the 21st century. What jobs are viable? What resources should be reallocated? If education is important, then we want to allocate those resources there. In order to get the best teachers, you've got to offer the best wages. We don't currently do that. And that's why people talk about problems in education. The problems begin with the funding and funding sources. Any teacher will tell you that.
Talking about education, talking about advancing people, why not take Yohuru's classes, tape them all, put them online, give them a workbook, offer it for free, whoever wants to go. And you go into a testing center once a month to take a proctored exam. There are simple solutions and answers to the problems out there, such as making education affordable to the masses, right? Especially in this digital age. I can learn, my kids go to college, when they ask a question to the professor, you know what they say? Look it up on YouTube. I mean, seriously, that's what the professor will say, look it up on YouTube. So there are answers out there. In this digital age, anybody can be what they want to be. There are MOOCs, massive online open courses that you can take.
You're definitely heading in the wrong direction in terms of that, because ultimately what you're doing then is creating a generation of young people who have no people skills. What are the jobs that they're going to do? Ultimately, when you start to dismantle public education, when you start talking about putting things online, automation, you're talking about putting people out of work. Where are the jobs to replace that? And ultimately, what are we saying? What do we value as a society when ultimately our answer to everything is put it up on the net and have testing centers? That doesn't begin to deal with the real human issues that impact cities across this country.
Michael, I'm going to give you a final word. Minimum wage. What's your pitch to people? Would you like to see it raised on a federal level?
I absolutely would. I think we need balance, and as the two other speakers talked about, certainly we need to create jobs, but we also need to have some balance. We need to rebuild our infrastructure, put people to work, and I'm a little concerned that the balance is out of whack. I think the income inequality, I've visited Brazil on a number of occasions, the income inequality, there's rich and there's poor, and most of the people are poor. And I think that's a real problem, and as you see the income inequality increase in our country, and I think it's just as bad now as it was, in the early 1900s, the Gilded Age, I think we really need to, we're out of whack, and we really need to change that.
Okay, guys, we're going to be back after this. We're about to go to our lightning round, a quick look at the week's top stories after this.